Good day, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Jacob Angevine, and I will be your host for today. Thank you for participating in Medidata's Emerging Biopharma and Early Stage Medical Device webinar series. To begin, we have a few housekeeping announcements to make. Your phone will be on mute throughout the webinar. However, if you should have any technical issues or questions to ask our experts, you may use the question and answer box found on the lower left of your screen. You should also be able to see a few resources on the console, including a listing of the entire webinar series, our Emerging Biopharma webpage, and an infographic that includes case study snippets. Feel free to enter any questions you may have in the question box at any time. Lastly, a recording of this webinar will be sent to you in a few days. With that, let me take this time to introduce you to Alethea Wieland. Alethea Wieland is founder and president of Clinical Research Strategies, LLC, an executive-level management consulting firm and boutique functional service provider for the life sciences industry. Her firm's solutions include analyzing the intersection of healthcare innovation and policy, providing flexible clinical trial resourcing, developing sustainable corporate affairs programs and policies, training and management resilient high-performing clinical operations teams, mitigating the risks of clinical trials, rescuing clinical trials in TMS, and facilitating transparent, accountable sponsor CRO partnerships. With that, Alethea, please take it away.
Thank you, Jacob, for the kind introduction, and hello, everyone, and welcome to the first in a series of 3 talks on early-stage medical device companies. It's a real pleasure to be with each of you today and give you some visibility into avoiding a few pitfalls when working in a medical device company. This talk can't possibly cover every imaginable scenario, especially in novel devices and diagnostics, combination products, and the recent growth of artificial intelligence and software as a medical device. However, I do hope to leave you with lessons learned that can be more broadly applied to your current situation and stage of product development. Let's review the agenda. There are numerous programs and activities involved in building a medical device company and its product. I'd like to focus on 5 main areas for the product roadmap, which are product development, quality management system, regulatory pathway, clinical evidence generation, and of course, commercialization. Over the next 20 minutes, I will summarize each program area and relevant challenges and pause for anonymous polls after each program area is described. I will then want to reveal the biggest pitfall for each program area with a brief case vignette. We will conclude with key takeaways and answer your questions. Now, when you look at this diagram, it is hardly representative of the 8 to 10 or maybe even 15 years it could take for your medical device to achieve its first sale, from the point of filing the first patent. And this can certainly be said about the product roadmap, with all the highly trained professionals and costs that go into successful clearance, approval, or exit. This work includes proof and concept, bench and animal testing, human factors, quality management system development and scalability, regulatory conformance, submissions, strategy, clinical trials, not to mention stakeholder and patient engagement, publication and reimbursement strategy that then gets adoption, and the list goes on and on. As Thomas Edison once said, opportunity is missed by most people because it is dressed in overalls and looks like work. Let's move to product development. This covers numerous activities. Are you building something novel and disruptive or just a better mousetrap? How good is the IP? Does it stand up to the competition? What about the preclinical data and usability efforts to ensure end users can use the device? Do you have the right literature and risk-benefit to prove the indications for use? Now, even today, there are so many challenges with software and cybersecurity, which pose new types of threats and risks. You have to think, is the product protected from malicious attack? So these challenges to the product development include all these necessary time, resources, costs, potentially even repeating the work. What about the threats to or the risks from the device itself? Many people in the clinical department probably are asking, have you locked the device design? We're ready to start the clinical trials. That too is very important. Another thing is that competition may surpass the state of the art. How about considering time to market and the relevance of your device? Does the customer still desire it as it is designed at an attractive price point once you're ready to commercialize? I'm curious to see what your experience is to our first poll, and we'll give you about 15 seconds to answer. Now just consider there is no wrong answer here, but which of these challenges have you experienced or observed in your company's product development? Is it time, resourcing, cost, repeating work? What about threats or risks to the device itself? Has anyone sought further clarification on locking the device design? Are you paying attention to the competition? How about time to market and relevance, customer desirability? Please take a moment to submit your question. Oh, so this is really, really interesting what the results are. Many of you are hyper-focused on the competition, which may actually surpass the state of the art. That's really, really interesting feedback. Now, certainly all the previous types of challenges can stop you dead in your tracks, but probably the most important pitfall that I have seen is time to market, relevance, and customer desirability as designed. Having worked for a Class 3 medical device company for 5 years, here's a little vignette I wanted to tell you about. Our staff saw that no matter how great the technology was, we couldn't engineer the cost down to be competitive, such that when we obtained CE mark, we could hardly convert enough sales. The device cost more than the competition that was already on the market. This resulted in the need to do more fundraising, re-engineer some designs, reduce device costs, and run additional larger clinical trials. Next up is the topic of quality management system. You know, many small companies often don't calculate the time-intensive nature of the entire company's involvement in quality documentation. A large amount of resources goes into the device history file, GXP, suppliers, manufacturing, and ensuring the QMS can scale down the road. The regulations require continuous quality improvement, or CQI, culture with management reviews on an annual basis. There's also an impact to quality in preparation for any type of submission, audit, or inspection. Numerous challenges bear fruit here. You can see many of them have the same themes as before in the product development of the roadmap, such as time and resources, let alone the cost to manage and maintain quality. What about the scalability of QMS by all the departments, something that is never really considered when you start hiring? What about supplier field or inspection problems, such as a sole supplier going out of business or being acquired? There's oftentimes that nagging, unexpected customer or regulator feedback, which impacts the device quality or risks, also known as complaints. So let's take our next poll. Which of these challenges have you experienced or observed in your company's quality management system? Is it the time and the resources and costs to manage and maintain quality? What about scalability of QMS by all the departments? Have you experienced supplier field or inspection problems? Maybe even a sole supplier goes out of business or is about to be acquired. Also, have you considered the customer regulatory feedback has impacted the device quality and risk complaints? Go ahead and take a moment to answer this poll question. And we did not get the answer, but we'll go ahead and describe a little bit more about one of the biggest pitfalls that I have seen is unexpected customer and regulatory feedback, which impacts the device quality or risks. The very same medical device company I worked for around 5 years ago had a problem with one of the accessories. It was a guide wire for catheter insertion. Now, some customers could work with it, but others really vehemently hated it, since it would occasionally kink and impair proper cannulation technique and successful start of device therapy. So down the road, this ultimately affected the clinical trials and the use in the commercial setting. It didn't matter that kinking could be caused by numerous factors unrelated to the guide wire design and stiffness, but think about those repercussions when physicians influence each other, especially at medical congresses and up-and-coming technology. Let's next focus on regulatory pathway. There's a lot to say about the latest MDR legislation in Europe and the regulatory reform underway by the FDA. We are left to ponder what is our best bet for a regulatory pathway. In my view, the latest MDR imposes a lot of new requirements, particularly difficult to maneuver for smaller companies, such that it is no longer a slam dunk to enter the EU market first. In fact, I believe it could be the opposite. So getting the regulatory assessment just right is much more important than ever before. Companies must always stay on top of the changes to prepare the best regulatory submissions, and the quality of the documentation in the submissions really does matter. So let's take a look at these challenges. Certainly, if you're a startup company or a smaller company that's privately held, you do experience a lot of investor pressures for expediency. Yet the regulatory landscape does not afford that. Documentation and evidence may not immediately meet the requirements, causing protracted review cycles and a company burn. Choosing the shortest pathway to market may not meet with commercialization success. And for those of you paying attention to the regulatory landscape, it is extremely fluid with a lot of reform in it. So let's take our next poll. This is our third poll. And we'll give you a few seconds here to address any of these challenges that you may have experienced or observed in your company's regulatory pathway. For instance, choosing the shortest pathway to market, which might not meet with commercialization success, investor pressure for expediency, documentation and evidence, which may not ultimately meet the requirements, causing a protracted review cycle or company burn, and then finally, this very fluid regulatory landscape. Let's see how you have answered. A mixed bag. Very interesting to see that investor pressure for expedience is about 50% of your company's concern, which is what I have experienced over the course of my career as well, oftentimes forcing the company to make shortcuts. So what I have seen is choosing the pathway that is the shortest time to market may not actually meet with commercialization success being the main pitfall under regulatory pathway. In my experience, many of my clients have chosen either the CE mark route or 510K route, but don't then have enough evidence to convert sales. Now they're floundering with how to accomplish more fundraising to produce evidence that matters most to physicians and payers, not to their investors. They also have not done enough work to convince medical societies to endorse or adopt their technology in clinical practice guidelines. In fact, one of my clients has even stepped away from their original product design and started a brand new product. So imagine 5 years of wasted time and energy in an original product design that didn't end up working. Next up is one of my favorite topics on clinical evidence. And clinical evidence generation is always one of the most expensive costs a medical device company has to account for. Designing just the right trials requires multiple conversations over many months with the regulators, key opinion leaders, patients, payers, participating physicians, and study sites, resolving questions about, do I need a first-in-man trial versus pivotal trial, or maybe some smaller trials coupled with a post-market real-world evidence study, are all those things that a small biotech company or medical device company has to consider. So too are the various partners if an outsourcing model with a CRO is to be selected. Challenges abound. Do we pick in-house staff? Do we outsource the models to conduct the trials? Time and cost can certainly not be marginalized. There's a ton of money that needs to go into those. What about agreement from the regulators on the trial power, design, endpoints? Sometimes this takes multiple rounds of review and discussion. Oftentimes, I have experienced more than 18 to 24 months for the regulators to agree on endpoints and study design. How about feedback from investigators and patients, medical societies and payers? Ultimately, CMS, you want to have a reimbursement opportunity at the end of the study as well. Is the study designed to prove that the intended use and indications for use is valid and that the risk-benefit is in good standing with the regulators? Let's take our fourth poll. Which of these challenges have you experienced or observed in your medical device company's clinical evidence program? Have you had problems with outsourcing models versus in-house staff? Have you seen cost and time balloon? What about agreement from regulators on trial power, design, endpoints? How about feedback from investigators, patients, medical societies, and payers? Has there been proof in the intended use and indications for use? Are you worried about the risk-benefit ratio? I'll give you a few moments to answer this poll. And let's see what your answers are. Well, 50% of you are consumed with what the regulators need, and that's a very good point to bring up. Very, very good. Others are interested in in-source versus outsource models, and then is the trial designed for its intended use and indications for use? So in my experience, one of the most important pitfalls I have seen over 30 years is that time and cost cannot be marginalized. So let me give you an example of this. A few years ago, I was part of a leadership team that rescued a pivotal trial for FDA approval from a U.S.-based CRO. Now, the trial originally cost $8 million and was to have been completed in 3 years with about 700 patients. Instead, due to the poor quality from the CRO and neglect at the research site level, the trial was amended to add 400 more patients, 8 more research sites, and 1.5 years. So that extension ended up costing the company, the sponsor, $16 million. So ultimately, it doubled in cost. But think about the risks and the cost of picking the wrong partners or strategy for your trials program. Let's talk about commercialization. I've seen over the years a lack of attention to one of the most important drivers of success, and that is a well-thought-out commercialization plan. Believe it or not, the preparation happens very early in the product roadmap. Is the product ready and cost-effective? Is it attractive for adoption with the level of clinical evidence and customer feedback? Are the product enhancements enough to convert more business and value? What is the plan for post-market surveillance and follow-up studies? These challenges show up when proper planning or execution in previous stages was taken for granted. So some of you may have experienced limited trial data and publications. Reducing the cost of care, does your device actually do that? Regulators are oftentimes looking for improving patient outcomes and reducing the cost of care. What about shortcuts taken in the product development, quality, or regulatory, or even clinical that dampens adoption? Is there a value proposition including against standard of care or the competition? And is there an ease of reimbursement? Let's take our next poll. Which of these challenges have you experienced or observed in your company's commercialization? Is it trial data and publications that seem to be limited? Is your device just simply not reducing the cost of care? Or maybe you don't have sufficient information from your clinical trials to help show that you're reducing the cost of care? How about improving patient outcomes? Are you buying them a little bit more time? Are you really impacting their disease? How about shortcuts taken in product development, quality, regulatory, or clinical that dampens the adoption? Is there a true value proposition against the competition? And do you have a reimbursement plan? Let's take a few moments to answer this final poll. And here are the answers, and it's not surprising at all to me that trial data and publications are limited. There's a lot of shortcuts that happen in much smaller trials. And just overall that shortcuts are taken probably because there's a lot of investor pressure to fast-track things through to commercialization. So in my experience and over the course of my career, I have seen that agreed with the results of the poll that shortcuts taken in product development, quality, regulatory, or clinical can actually dampen the adoption. And let me just give you a quick case vignette that two of my rescue clients that I've recently taken on took too many shortcuts in quality, clinical, and regulatory along the way to have only been rejected by low customer acquisition after completing all that work. So imagine all that fundraising and hiring of staff and bearing all the responsibility of maintaining a quality system and actually running trials that took 8 to 10 years respectively. And what I'm doing and what I was hired on to do was to do a lot of remediation work and salvage work. We're trying to see if there's other things in other clinical trials that we can do to get the company back on track. But the bottom line is that imagine all that money that went to waste. And so some of my final takeaways are, in avoiding these major pitfalls, is having realistic fundraising communication milestones and timelines. Be aware of the shortcuts taken early that impact the success later. Hiring the right resources is key. Engineering cost or risk down will be relevant once the device is approved or cleared, and nothing will ever go as planned, so you have to change your expectations. So Jacob, I am happy to take your questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Alicia. Folks, as mentioned earlier, please send in your questions via the chat box found on the lower left hand of your screen. Alicia, it looks like we've gotten our first question here, and that is it okay to have clinical trials with different versions of a medical device?
That's a very good question, and I would like to offer it depends. I have certainly worked in multiple companies as a consultant and as the sponsor's representative clinical lead, where the engineering of the device, the lock, had not sufficiently occurred where, the device that would then be sent into the regulators was the same. And so companies really need to be very careful about making sure that a device is locked and that you're getting sufficient quality data with that particular device, and then what you then choose to do with that data. So it just really depends. It depends on the quality and the quantity of the patients studied in those clinical trials and what the ultimate goal is. Certainly to have a pilot study as a proof in concept is acceptable. You then maybe augment the device with a new version and satisfy basic conformance and things like that. But you have to be very, very careful.
Great, that's very helpful. Thank you. It looks like the next question that we have is, how do you balance investor pressures to race through to commercialization or satisfactory milestones for a potential exit against the reality of time and cost?
And that's another really good question because I'm assuming that most of the attendees today are from a smaller, mid-sized company that's privately held, and that pressure is, always there. And I oftentimes, having worked with senior management before, is you've got to have realistic expectations. You cannot say that the milestones can be met when they absolutely can't be. And so I think that you've got to really come up with the proper milestones, whether it is a milestone to do a submission to the FDA for an IDE study, or whether it is we're going to do a small study to only get CE mark, and what that timetable is to then get CE mark has to be realistic. And everyone in the company needs to know what those milestones are to achieve them.
Awesome. Thank you, Alicia. It looks like we have time for about one more question here. So I think the last question we have is, where is the better location, the United States or Europe, to conduct clinical trials that have a better impact on adoption?
Yeah, and those are really, really pointed question here. Is I get this all the time, and I will answer this, it really depends. So assuming that the audience is mostly U.S. sponsors, that with the passage of the European MDR, there are many more hurdles to overcome with CE now. And I think that companies really need to analyze what the best value is in terms of the data quality and the data quantity, but also do some stress testing on the cost of shipping devices to Europe, having a footprint in Europe to actually run those studies, understand, all the various depots and the representatives that you have to have in Europe, versus the more unique reform and pathways that the U.S. FDA is carving out. So, for instance, we're getting more interesting style designs of clinical trials using adaptive design principles, where you can stop the study early for success or futility. There's also earlier pathways that you can take, deploying things like a pilot study, maybe then seamlessly going into a pivotal trial and doing a PMA or the de novo submission. So I sort of am on the fence with answering that question in real deliberate terms. I'm always open-minded. I have seen more reform be more flexible in the U.S., especially with some of the latest pathways available to medical device companies.
Thank you. Wow, those are great insights, Alicia. It looks like we're just about out of time here. So, Alicia, thank you again. Very informative talk that you gave today. And for those of you who had additional questions, please feel free to reach out to Alicia directly. Her contact details are in the speaker bio widget on your screen. And as a reminder, for more information on why Medidata is the #1 eClinical solutions provider to emerging biopharma, visit the Emerging Biopharma page shown on your screen or in the Resources section of the webinar platform. Additionally, please join our next webinar on December 11th, titled Top 5 Ways to Reduce Study Build Times. Thank you, and have a great day.